you so much for having me here. And I'm really excited about this talk, The Hidden Story of Building Injustice. And it really is a complete pleasure to have this. I just wanted to actually let you guys give the heads up. I will be doing a live poll as part of this presentation. So it's Mentimeter to make the presentation itself interactive. So if you guys can, I put that into the chat just before I came in. So if you can just pop that inside your phones. It doesn't take any of your personal information or like that. It's just about the questions I'll be asking as I'll be going along. And that's it. So let's get started. The hidden story of building injustice. As buildings have evolved over time, from teepees to stone buildings to glass buildings, with the development of building technologies, the human threshold itself has actually decreased. As a result, we've actually seen energy usage and energy consumption increase. The residential and commercial buildings themselves, the fossil fuels, have accounted for 29% of the US green gas emissions. We realize this is a problem. However, at the same time, what we have been doing, which is incredible, we've been looking at ways how to deal with the energy use. And there's been some great innovative work done amongst everyone in this room, and still are doing it, in terms of taking the whole building science approach into buildings and making it comfortable as much as possible through insulation, continuous air barrier, thermally broken windows that are high performing, no thermal bridges, energy recovery ventilation. So all these great things are really helping in terms of making buildings perform, be comfortable, and very efficient. As a result, there has been some reductions in the commercial and residential buildings from 17 to 11% respectively since the 2005 peak. Even in the chaos of a pandemic, where we have been experimenting and adjusting to this new lifestyle, or whatever it's called, normal, we've actually still had a good impact on our carbon footprint. As many as 2.6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions themselves haven't been released into the atmosphere. So we are making some headways. But one of the things that keeps coming up, climate change is here. We hear about it, we're actually seeing it right now as well. It affects air, water, earth, and everyone, especially the vulnerable. So then I pose a question to you. What comes to mind when you think about vulnerable people? So if you type in, if you already have, put in the menti.com in your phone, if you type that code in, it should be able to generate all your, and if people are more comfortable just typing them into the chat, that's also fine as well. So we have two here: coastal areas, low resilience, okay. Low-lying villages, overheating. See, just the homeless people we have in the chat, especially in heat waves. Yep. Lack of food, healthcare, money, shelter. Nice. All right, that's great. Marginal community. Code does not work. Devil, are you doing 18421481? Yep. Oh, thank you, Sean. All right, so this is great. We're seeing this basically people come up with pretty much what defines and begins to define vulnerable communities. And here's a sampling of the chart, which I've come to similar to what you guys were saying: children, elderly, people with disabilities, minority groups. But actually the trajectory is not always as simple as it looks. What are the things that makes these communities vulnerable to climate change? And I think that's what we're really trying to understand. Why is it that makes them so vulnerable? And in order to look at this, I'm going to be using New York City as an example. I'm going to begin with the policies itself. The way cities and metropolitan regions are designed and planned following practices and policies does not give access to everyone to fair living conditions that are affordable, accessible, and clean. These policies actually result to creating environmental sacrifice zones that usually are where the vulnerable communities live. A great example of this is actually racist housing redlining law of the mid-20th century used by the Federal Housing Administration to insure mortgages. And this is an old map of Manhattan. It shows the following colors being used. Green was used as the best area because that's where white people lived. Blue was used as still desirable because it had not gentrified as much yet. C was seen as definitely declining because of gentrification of Black people entering. And D was seen as hazardous because Black people were there. Needless to say that this, as a result of this, it was a way of actually defining who gets ownership and who does not. And as a result, New Yorkers, longtime New Yorkers, some of them haven't had an opportunity to have ownership because of this. And the other effects of this, security and wealth, as the areas have gentrified and haven't lived up to the classifications that they have had, they've actually become more desirable. But as they become more desirable, the outer reach for the vulnerable community now. So as you start mapping this further down in New York, you begin to see a pattern emerging. And this is actually outlines the significant maritime and industrial areas, the SMIAs, which are actually along the periphery of New York, which you have Area 1, which is South Bronx, Area 3, which is like Brooklyn, then you have the Red Hook area, which is over here, then Staten Island area. These areas also happen to be where in the environmental justice community conversation will be areas, communities that happen to also be low income. So you actually feel that typical stereotype, what we were mentioning earlier. And as you start mapping the SMI areas, you actually see the same, there's overlapping, just like similar to anything else. You actually see the people of color are actually in these darker pink areas is also where the people of color happen to live. So 66% of community of color are actually in the darker purple areas. Although these areas are gentrifying, it's not actually areas that are actually getting much of the needed help that they need. This is also true for the land use. These areas obviously happen to have the overlay of manufacturing and industrial land use, where some have been in Brooklyn and in Williamsburg, which have become now residential. But majority of the parts over here in the South Bronx to parts of Brooklyn here, they're actually still very much part of industrial and manufacturers that are still part of it being actually where it was previously. These areas are also below the poverty line. Again, areas of dark red. Obviously, most of Manhattan itself is lighter. So you begin to see the inequality gap showing much more vastly as the colors get more darker. Median household income, again, the darker green showing those below the income level itself is less than what any typical New Yorker would be. They're still around this whole periphery. Percent without health care. And this is actually data from Department of New York City Department of Health. A lot of people who happen to be located around the SMI areas, they also happen to not have healthcare. So if there was an event of a toxic exposure or anything, they wouldn't be able to get healthcare immediately. FEMA, which has been one of the things in terms of looking at resiliency in general, the 2020 and 2025, as flood levels begin to rise, these are also areas where these communities are located. The hurricane storm surge, facilities handling hazardous substance or toxic chemicals. In the event, if anything was to happen, these areas could represent a threat. And as a result, the vulnerable communities will be the first impacted. So you can see that there's a consistency when you start putting in the overlays in general, just about in response to climate change and what we're looking at with from flood levels to median income, to the people who actually live there, the accessibility, however things were placed previously, and where the vulnerable actually live. So just for myself, I actually wanted to crunch the numbers a little bit just to understand the energy burden. And I took the numbers of the extremely low income New Yorkers. This is for a 4-family. They make just over 32,000, which really isn't much. Rent, according to HPD, would be $631. Child care for average for one child in New York City for a whole year is $16,250. and the percentage uninsured is 14.3. So when you start crunching down these numbers further and just basically just doing as we all would be, running our home numbers to see what's left over when we pay out everything, it's actually not a lot left over. It's actually close to $141. So if you're a one-person income, you're really not actually be able to save much. And this does take into account that tenants pay electrical bills, that tenants pay for the electricity, no electric, so there's no electric stove. And I know we're having a shift here, but at the same time, these are buildings that haven't really changed over to become high performing or are passive house building. This is just a reality for most extremely low income New Yorkers right now. I think one of the things that drew to me while I was doing this overlapping exercise in general, looking at everything, I was reading that the architecture, planning, health, transportation, land use, security, everything is all connected. It cannot simply be the act of architects doing the job of architects, planners doing the job of planners. We all have to merge together. Even when you look at the race, poverty, and healthcare, it's all connected in New York City. The larger bubbles actually showing us the higher rates of children who actually are prone to asthma just because of the indoor air quality, something that's becoming more and more relevant in the age of COVID. Even when we start breaking down the site to where the campus is of, this is a NYCHA campus, for example, that I was looking at earlier this year. There's a subway line that runs direct, this is the campus itself here, and there's a subway line that runs along this road over here, and then one over here, which is the end. So this campus itself is very close to subways. But as you look at retrofitting it, it cannot be simple as just every building's going to get the same thing. It's because one building is more prone to pollution, air pollution itself. And not only that, all the buildings are not the same type, they're not the same shape, they have different things. Every building will be unique. One of the main things that also drew to me about this particular location when I was looking at it, the NYCHA campus itself, both these two large campuses, they were not really connected to the outside of the community. And they kind of were just left alone. And the intent is really to break these super blocks as we're looking at them. It's not just about the performance of them being very high efficient, but it's about them being integrated into the very sites that they also belong to. And this was actually happened to be a flood zone area as well. So it's actually more complicated. So how do you actually move people away? So one of the things that we started doing was really breaking it down, how each buildings will be treated differently as a result of that. So then I posed the question again to you, so who are we designing for? Are we designing for, I don't want to say, but who are we designing for, I guess? So again, if you could just put into that same code, that would be great. So I have mine written down because I didn't want to influence any of you. Right. It's interesting for me to see what I do see right now. The average person, the most vulnerable families, health, people. Okay, so we're getting some everyone. Okay, great. Affluent, wealthy, average person. Okay, nice. All right, so I'll share mine with you. And I wrote this down. And mine was really based on my clients. So I wrote down NGOs, not-for-profit, citizens investing in a sustainable lifestyle, and developers. And I think this was really driven by who I'm designing for, not necessarily who necessarily that client is. And even when I look at this list over here, future generations, the most vulnerable, the most deprived, is that really our client right now? Are these the clients that we come back and we were actually listening to and designing? And it's the one of the questions I keep asking myself, even in my own design practice. Even in the group that I mentioned that I was looking at, the clientele that I serve, I felt it was a small subset group that has resources and the wherewithals to influence design needs and demands. this innovation that we're part of may be passive house to net zero. Why is it that this group is only, it doesn't seem very inaccessible, it's not inclusive to that broader community that we just listed, and it should be. They don't have, most of my interaction has been that majority do not actually know what even a passive house or a net zero house necessarily always is. And I think one of the main reasons when I really kind of break it down, it's because that sizable population that happens to be vulnerable doesn't really always have an equal partnership at that table. When we're designing, we are designing with different things in mind, where energy is also becoming one of the most important things, and the vulnerable communities a second. How do we achieve this? And this dialogue about how do we achieve this, I think has been something that's we've been trying to address with all the great work we have been doing in our high performance community. But I think one of the main things that at least I feel sometimes is missing is this collective vision of interdisciplinary and experimental partnership, where you have to have architecture, the planning, the health, etc., come together. We're living in unprecedented times, and because of that, I feel buildings are no longer going to be just like we know a formula to make buildings work energy wise. I don't think necessarily that is the same formula that's going to be helping vulnerable communities. In order to produce some of these are hypothetical examples I'm giving out here. Is it the equation of architecture plus health plus insurance, where we're looking at affordability in a very different way? So you have access to better health, which is basically as part of these affordable buildings, and therefore the insurance rates are also built in. We're asking different emergence of different people coming together, which normally would not have. I know this has been happening across in Europe, architecture, planning, and finance, encouraging home ownership where people are making high performance buildings, but they also get a significantly lower rate, and maybe it's not just based on rates, it's maybe based on some kind of like the air tightness of your buildings. Like, how do we start breaking what we've normally have known in the past? How do we start making that new era of thinking? This is a project, Haven Green in New York City, that was an RFP that I did with Curtis and Ginsberg Architects. And this site over here, this is a public sculpture park. And it was really important for the community not to take the park away, because it was a park there for many, many years, and it was part of the identity of the area, downtown Soho. So what we did in the end is, when we looked at this RFP, one is we decided not to completely build out just because of the scale of the buildings, just being close to 5 stories. And the second thing is we left the park being the park for the community itself, because it felt that was something that they identified themselves with, and it was as part of like the neighborhood to grow and to be part of the existing people that live there. It was necessary for us to be able to work with a participatory design process that they still feel that the park is theirs. And this is a mapping exercise that was actually created in order to actually look at this as a big picture way, where we were not necessarily coming with just units, etc., but visionary exercises where what do they see as part of this space, this open space, which obviously is part connected to a building, but how does that still become theirs as well as like integrated into a design as well? So would it be gardening, art installation? Do they become involved in this over time as well? So there was a lot of workshops, and it was, for me personally, it's also a very different exercise that I had never done before. It was quite eye-opening. I think one of the main things that I constantly see, even in COVID, is the vulnerability that we're all being faced with, whether we're actually isolated or not. And I think with these natural disasters, which are happening even now with the heat island effect, they actually form, I feel like, a neutral ground for people to come together. It's a reminder that when the most vulnerable itself are not protected and they're most prone to risk, we as a result are also going to be affected as well. So one of the things is like maybe using these opportunities to actually thinking about future proofing, resiliency is the resiliency aspect. What does that mean? Whether it's in Portland, whether it's in New York, future planning of building envelope nodes evaluated and then assessed according to electrification is an opportunity to build an equity lens framework to be adopted by all. This is a great story that I found, and this is as a result of Hurricane Harvey. And in Houston itself, what they ended up doing is a place that was very much divided. They actually ended up forming a coalition for environment, equity, and resiliency. And they actually eventually put it part of the Houston policy itself, is in order to make people accountable as a community. So if there was to be any further storms or any kind of things that impacts their resiliency, they're actually coming together. It's an experiment. They don't really have anything good or bad right now to say, other than it's working. It's working where these people who normally would not have teamed up together, whether they are rich or poor, they actually care about the same thing. They care about being safe. So what makes a design equitable? And I'm not trying to trick anyone here. There's no right or wrong answers. So just type whatever you like. I see PH proofing with good equitable design. Okay, Peter, thank you. Accessibility, access, accessible, healthy, nice. Collaboration and fairness, universal design. This is great. Okay, nice. Respect the individual. Thanks, Patricia. Healthier. Nice. Responds to the needs of people. All right. I actually went a little bit deeper. I went ahead and actually questioned myself critically. I felt it was more about acknowledging our own implicit biases to design. And we know we already are ahead of the curve, and we're building these great performing buildings, which has data, which has performance. But I think design, in my opinion, is very subjective to the way we see design, and it's a very subjective field, how what we like, what we dislike, what we associate to be wealthy, what we associate to be poor. And I think that is definitely needed, because I think as we start to design things, in order to be able to design more equitably, we need to be able to have a somewhat of a blank slate, to not have our own preconceptions actually defining that space beforehand. And I'm not saying it's like an easy task to do. It's a hard one. It's just the profiling, for example, of affordable buildings just being these very square blocks which feel non-approachable, sometimes very non-architectural too, and with the backdrop of these glass buildings, which in my opinion are not either any more exciting, but they're still forming some kind of change. We're starting to stereotype what we see as being wealthy, poor, or materials, etc. And this is something that I feel constantly happens, where we immediately identify what is a expensive building to what is a poor building. So one of the things when I was working with Chris Benedict and we were working on this affordable project, the intent really was here to obviously make it perform to building science, have the shading aspect, have it look different, have it be part of the community. The truth is, I wasn't necessarily thinking about the community at that time. What I was really thinking about was, how do I make this building not look like a typical affordable building? And the reason for that is I wanted this building to look pretty in its environment. I also wanted to be a building that I could actually talk about, that building that serves the architecture language of being architecturally formed. It's only actually much later that I realized what it really meant to the community when people actually came there to visit this building, and how it made these people feel, who actually happened to be mostly seniors. There was certainly a sense of pride. People coming where they were cleaning up their own like areas from outside, from the front yard. The hallways were always kept immaculate. There was a sense of pride that they had this special building. And I think for me personally, it was kind of like my aha moment, um, that buildings actually do matter a lot more to the people who also live there who may have very little say. It's not just about putting it down, having buildings come up to the ground itself, which you just walk past, but having that sense of greenery out there, how you engage with it, how other people are responding to it. This is very much how a sense of pride is created in a community too, because they feel in some ways they're actually being addressed to, as you know. So it was definitely an interesting experience for me when I look back now, certain things that maybe that I didn't realize and what I was trying to do. So what could we do differently? And I think one of the things personally I feel like in the work that we do, we're doing amazing work for sure. But that work is heavily still focused on climate change being energy. It will be great if we start recognizing it also with environmental justice as we start mapping these communities out, as we start looking at who we're actually designing for. And that doesn't really mean that, hey, you're going to go in and interview every person, but it definitely means within your own practice, within your own way of looking at things that you're doing, are we really pushing, making that extra push to make buildings even more better? And I actually feel this community can do that. I think the very fact that we're discussing this is amazing. Having ownership, holding each other accountable, having some kind of time in practices where people are putting that time out there to say, okay, this is what we've done in the past, but it might not be recognized to do right now. So really kind of honing that in, just spending that time. So the accountability of practice itself changing, I think, is very high. So I really like this time of COVID, which some people might totally not like. Um, I like it because I think it's critical, it's exciting, it's a time to bridge gaps and ideas. It's completely experimentation in some ways. And it's also hope. If we've got through most of the COVID, there's hope for the next generation. If we still manage to accomplish all this, even in a country where has gone through so much, I think there's definitely hope for different changes. And I think this is exactly where we are right now. So I'm excited. I'm excited for the next things that this community does and to be part of this too. Thank you. And I'll leave you with this. A good design adds value faster than it adds cost. So that's it.